The ice was a liar. It whispered of solidity, of a safe, gray path across the still water, but Cecily Thorne knew its secrets. She knew the language of the hairline fractures that spoke of weakness, the milky patches that warned of depthless cold beneath. She had been raised on the edge of this very estate, on land that had once belonged to her family, before her father's foolishness had signed it all away, and the lake had been her bleakest, most constant companion. This afternoon it was speaking of danger. A brittle cold had settled over the park, freezing the very air in the lungs. The sun was a pale disk, offering light but no warmth. It was the sort of day that drove sensible people indoors to huddle by their fires. But Cecily was not sensible. She was desperate for a momentous peace, a lungful of air that did not smell of boiled cabbage, and her brother-in-law's disappointment. She was walking the perimeter, a route she had trod 1,000 times, when she saw him, a small figure in a dark blue coat, no taller than her own hip, standing perilously far out on the frozen surface. He was utterly still, a tiny, lonely statue in the vast white expanse. Her heart gave a painful lurch. It was the Duke of Grimsby's boy, Arthur. Everyone in the village knew of him. The silent child, the little ghost who haunted the great house since his mother, the Duchess, had been taken by a fever 2 winters ago. She almost called out, but something in his posture stopped her. It was not the posture of play. It was the posture of vigil. He was staring down at the ice, as if trying to see through to the dark water below. A breath of wind skittered across the surface, carrying with it a sound so faint she almost missed it, a crack. Not the groan of settling ice, but a sharp, splintering report, like a pistol shot muffled by snow. And then the world seemed to move in horrifying, slow motion. The gray surface around the boy fractured, a spiderweb of black lines racing outward. He gave a single, startled cry, a sound of pure surprise, and then he was gone. The water swallowed him in a rush of dark, churning cold. Cecily did not think. She ran. Her worn boots slipped on the frozen bank, her sensible woolen skirts tangling around her legs. All the years of being quiet, of being useful, of being overlooked, fell away. There was only the broken ice, and the black water, and the childa. "Hold on!" as she screamed, the words torn from her throat by the wind. She reached the edge of the lake, her mind racing. She could not go straight out. The ice that had broken for a child would never hold her. She scanned the bank, her eyes snagging on a fallen branch, thick as her arm and long. It was half frozen to the ground, but she wrenched at it with a strength born of pure panic, her gloves tearing, her fingers screaming in the cold. It came free, with a crack of frozen mud. Shoving it ahead of her, she lay flat on her stomach, distributing her weight, as her father had taught her in a life so long ago it felt like someone else's. She pushed forward, the brutal cold of the ice seeping through her coat, her cheek pressed to its unforgiving surface. The hole seemed impossibly far. She could see nothing. No movement. No coat. Just the churning black water. "Eh, Arthur?" she shouted, her voice raw. "Eh, Arthur? Make a sound." A small sputtering cough answered her, a flash of dark blue. His head broke the surface, his face a mask of shock and terror, his small hands clawing uselessly at the sharp, crumbling edges of the ice. He was going under again. "Ah! The branch!" she yelled, pushing it with all her might. It slid across the ice, the end of it bumping against the hole. Grab the branch. His eyes, wide and dark with cold, found her. He seemed not to understand. His movements were becoming sluggish, the cold already stealing his strength. "Arthur, you must listen to me. Grab hold of the branch." She pushed it closer, the tip of it nudging his shoulder. His small frozen fingers fumbled, then closed around it. His grip was weak. "Hold tight," as she said, her voice a low, urgent command. She began to pull, inch by agonizing inch, sliding backward on her belly. The branch was slick with ice and water. His weight was a dead, terrifying anchor. The ice groaned under her, a low, guttural protest. She did not dare to look down. She kept her eyes fixed on the small, pale face, the blue lips, the dark hair plastered to his skull. "I have you, she murmured, more to herself than to him. "I have you, just hold on." He was too heavy, or she was too weak. The drag of his waterlogged coat was immense. For a terrible moment she thought she would lose him, that he would slip from the branch, and she would watch him sink into the blackness forever. A sob of desperation caught in her throat. She dug her toes into the frozen ground at the lake's edge, finding a purchase, and gave one last, desperate heave. He came free of the water with a great sucking sound, sliding onto the solid ice like a landed fish. He was shivering violently, his teeth chattering in a rapid, uncontrollable rhythm. He did not make a sound, only stared at her with those huge, haunted eyes. There was no time for relief. The cold was a patient killer. She scrambled to her feet, pulling him up. He was a dead weight, his limbs already stiffening. She ripped off her own thick woolen coat, ignoring the immediate, biting shock of the wind on her damp blouse, and wrapped it around his small, shaking body. It swallowed him whole. We have to get to the house," she said, half carrying, half dragging him. Can you walk, Arthur? You must try." He stumbled, his legs refusing to obey him. She hooked her arms under his, pulling his back against her chest, and began the long, punishing journey up the sloping parkland, toward the great house, Grimsby Park, a place she had only ever seen from a distance. A cold, stone monolith against the winter sky. Now, it was their only hope. Every step was a battle. He was so heavy, and she was so cold. Her own body had begun to shake, her wet clothes freezing against her skin. The grand facade of the house seemed to get no closer. She fixed her eyes on a single window, a point of light in the growing dusk, and put one foot in front of the other. The boys, shivering, began to subside, a terrifying sign that his body was losing its fight against the cold. Apathy was the final stage before the end. "I know, she whispered, shaking him slightly. Stay with me, Arthur. We are almost there. Think of the fire." A great, roaring fire. She was gasping for breath when she finally stumbled onto the grand graveled drive. The sheer scale of the place was overwhelming. It was not a home, it was a monument. She staggered toward the enormous front doors, her last reserves of strength failing. She raised a hand to beat against the carved oak, but her arm felt like lead. She managed one feeble knock before her legs gave way, and she collapsed onto the top step, the unconscious boy a heavy weight in her arms. The door was thrown open. A footman in livery stared down his face, a perfect mask of horror and confusion. "Oh my God," he breathed. Then the world dissolved into a chaos of voices, of running feet, of hands reaching down to take the boy from her. She heard someone shout for the Duke, the name echoing in the cavernous hall. She was vaguely aware of being helped to her feet, of being guided into the warmth. The sudden change in temperature made her dizzy, her vision swimming. A woman with a face like a clenched fista, the housekeeper, she presumed was barking orders. Amana's voice, low and sharp, with command, cut through the noise. What happened? Someone tell me what happened." The lake, your grace," a footman stammered. The young maestra, he fell in." Cecily leaned against a cold marble pillar, shivering uncontrollably. She saw them carrying Arthur up the grand staircase. A small, limp bundle in Amana's arms. She saw the Duque's face, a pale, taut mask of terror. He was following them, his eyes fixed on his son. He did not see her. No one did. In the panic and the rush, she was just a piece of furniture, a damp, shivering woman in a torn blouse and muddy skirts, her own coat wrapped around the child who was the center of their universe. A maid, a young girl with kind eyes, pressed a cup of hot tea into her hands. Her fingers were too numb to hold it properly. "You were? The one who pulled him out," the girl whispered, her voice full of awe. Cecily nodded, unable to speak. "You saved him," but no one else seemed to have registered that fact. The housekeeper approached her, her expression severe. You will wait here," she commanded, as if Cecily were a tradesperson who had tracked mud on the floor. Cecily was led to a small uncomfortable chair in a cold anteroom off the main hall, and there she was left. She sat dripping onto the polished floor, listening to the frantic but muffled sounds from upstairs. She heard doors opening and closing, voices calling for hot water, for blankets, for the doctor to be sent for. Time stretched and became meaningless. The tea grew cold in her hands. Her own shivering slowly subsided, leaving behind a deep, aching cold in her bones. She was forgotten. She should leave, she thought. Her part was done. Her family would be wondering where she was. But she could not bring herself to move. She needed to know if the boy would be all right. She had held his life in her hands, and the weight of it still lingered. An hour passed. Then another. The great clock in the hall chimed 7, then 8. No one came. The grand house, for all its light and frantic activity, had swallowed her whole and rendered her invisible. She was the woman who had pulled the Duca's son from the frozen lake, and they did not even know her name. A name written in frost, she thought, with a flicker of her usual dry irony. Made of nothing, and melting away just as fast. She drew her thin shawl tighter, closed her eyes and waited. The Duke of Grimsby, Crispin, stood by his Sonos bed and watched him breathe. It was a simple mechanical act, the rise and fall of a small chest beneath a mountain of blankets, but for hours it had been the only thing that mattered in the world. The doctor had come and gone, leaving behind reassurances and the lingering scent of brandy. The boy was cold, exhausted, but his lungs were clear. He would be well. The words were a balm, but they did not stop the tremor in Crispin's hands. He had been a duke for half his life, handed a title and its crushing obligations when his own father died. He was accustomed to control, to order, to the world, bending to his will. But in the moment he had seen Arthura's limp body being carried into the hall, all of that had crumbled to dust. He was not a duke. He was a father who had almost lost his son, a father who had failed, again, to protect the only precious thing he had left. Grief was a cold house, and he had lived in it for 2 years, ever since Eleanor's death. He had managed it, contained it, locked it away behind a wall of duty and reserve, but the sight of his son, pale and still, had shattered the locks. The terror was a physical thing, a cold sickness in his gut that was only now beginning to recede, leaving behind a vast, hollow emptiness. He noticed things. It was the one faculty that had not been dulled by his title. He noticed the way a footman's hand shook as he poured wine, the way a petitioner's gaze would flicker to the door, the exact moment when polite conversation tipped into genuine feeling. It was this habit of observation that had made him a formidable negotiator and a lonely man. And as he stood in the quiet, firelit room, his gaze fell on the coat that had been discarded at the foot of the bed. It was not Arthur's. It was a woman's coat, of heavy, good-quality wool, but worn at the cuffs and collar. The buttons were plain carved from bone, not the fashionable jet of London. A single tear in the lining had been mended with neat, almost invisible stitches. It was the coat of a gentlewoman, but a poor one, and it smelled faintly of winter air and lavender. He picked it up. It was still damp. This was the coat the maid had said was wrapped around Arthur, the coat of the woman who had pulled him from the ice. A sudden, sharp shame pierced through his exhaustion. In the terror for his son, he had not even seen her. He had charged up the stairs blind and deaf to everything but Arthur's faint breathing. The woman who had saved his Sona's life had been left downstairs like a forgotten parcel. He turned to the maid, who was quietly tidying the hearth. "The woman who brought my son home," he said, his voice low and hoarse. Where is she?" The maid jumped, startled. "Ah." Finch put her in the morning room. "Your Grace to wait." To wait. The words were colder than he intended. He strode from the room, the coat still in his hand. The great house was settling into a late evening quiet. The frantic energy had passed. He descended the stairs, his boots echoing in the marble hall. The morning room was dark. He pushed the door open. Empty. He found Mrs. Breed. Finch, his formidable housekeeper, supervising the polishing of silver, an activity she deployed in times of crisis as a way of restoring order to the universe. The woman, he said without preamble, where is she? Finch did not look up from her task. She left, Your Grace, an hour or more ago. She said she could wait no longer. Did she give a name? A Thorne, the housekeeper said, her tone dismissive. A Miss Cecily Thorne. Her father was that solicitor who lost everything. They live in the village now, in that cramped little cottage by the church. The unspoken addendum hung in the air. She was nobody of consequence, Cecily Thorne. He knew the name. He had seen her, he realized, from a distance. A tall, serious-looking woman with dark hair, always walking alone. He had noticed her, in the way he noticed the turn of the seasons, or the shifting of the cloudasses, a constant, unremarkable feature of the landscape, and she had saved his son. She had gone onto the ice, pulled him from the water, wrapped him in her own coat, and carried him half a mile to this house. And his household staff, his responsibilia, had sat her in a cold room and forgotten her. A wave of self-disgust washed over him. He had inherited more debts of feeling than of money, and had discharged both badly. Have the carriage made ready, he said to the nearest footman. Tonight, Your Grace? The man asked, his eyes wide. No, Crispin said, his voice flat and final. I will call on Miss Thorne myself. He went back upstairs, the worn wool coat feeling heavy and accusatory in his hand. He would make it right. He would thank her. He would reward her. It was a debt, and he would pay it. That was how his world worked. That was the only way he knew how to make it work. He did not consider, not for a moment, that some things could not be settled like a tradesman's bill, but men are slow, child, and dukes are slowest of all. And grief makes fools of the cleverest of us. The morning brought with it a cold, gray light, and the familiar ache of resentment. Cecily was in the kitchen of the small, crowded house she shared with her sesterous family, trying to coax a flame from damp kindling. Her brother-in-law, a man whose ambitions had long outstripped his abilities, was already complaining about the cost of tea. Her sister, worn down by disappointment and 3 boisterous children, was trying to mend a shirt with fingers clumsy from the cold. Cecilia's body ached. A deep, shivering chill had settled into her bones, and every muscle protested the previous day's exertions. She had returned home late, muddy and coatless, to a barrage of questions she had no energy to answer. She had simply said a child had an accident, and she had helped. She did not say it was the Duca's son. It would only lead to fevered speculation, to her brother-in-law's greedy calculations. Her heroism, such as it was, felt private and fragile, and she could not bear to have it pawed at by their grubby hopes. A knock at the door silenced the room. It was too early for visitors. Her brother-in-law, George, grumbled as he went to answer it, expecting a tradesman chasing a bill. Cecily heard his voice, sharp and annoyed, then a sudden, choked silence. He backed into the kitchen, his face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. Following him was the Duke of Grimsby. He seemed to fill the small, cramped room, his height and the sheer breadth of his shoulders sucking all the air from it. He was dressed, not in country tweeds, but in severe, perfectly tailored black, a figure of immense and intimidating power. He held her worn woolen coat, draped over one arm. The silence in the kitchen was absolute, broken only by the sputtering of the fire Cecily had finally managed to light. His gaze swept the room, taking in the worn furniture, the mended tablecloth, the general air of things being barely held together. He noticed the way Cecilia's sister nervously wiped her hands on her apron, the way George seemed to have forgotten how to breathe, and then his eyes, A startlingly clear, cold gray settled on Cecily. "A Miss Thorne," he said. His voice was low and resonant, a sound that did not belong in this small, shabby space. Your Grace," she replied, her own voice steady, though her heart had begun a frantic, panicked drumming against her ribs. She gave a small, correct curtsy, a motion so ingrained she did it without thought. My son?" he began, and his voice lost some of its formal edge, roughened by an emotion he could not quite conceal. "The doctor says he will be well, thanks to you. I'm glad to hear it," she said quietly. He stepped forward and held out her coat. "You left this behind." She took it from him, the familiar weight of the wool, a strange comfort. Their fingers brushed for a fraction of a second. His skin was cold. Was concerned. "For the boy," she said, by way of explanation for her hasty departure. It was a lie, of course. She had been dismissed and forgotten. But a poor gentlewoman with opinions is a luxury no household can afford. You were treated abominably by my staff," he said, his gaze direct and unflinching, "and by me. I was distracted. There is no excuse. I have come to offer my profound apologies and my gratitude." Our brother-in-law made a small, eager sound. Cecily could feel his avarice radiating across the room. There is no need for apologies, Your Grace," she said, her voice cool. Anyone would have done the same." But they did not," he countered. You did. You risked your own life." He paused, and for a moment, the mask of the powerful Duke slipped, revealing a glimpse of the terrified father beneath. "You saved my son's life. That is a debt that cannot be easily repaid. But I mean to try. Here it comes." She thought a familiar, bitter taste in her mouth. The reward. The purse of gold to settle the account, to wipe the slate clean so the great man could walk away, his conscience clear, the messy business of human obligation neatly concluded. "I find myself in need of a companion for my son," he said, the words sounding rehearsed, as if he had practiced them in the carriage. "He has been withdrawn since his mother's death. He will not speak to the tutors. He has driven away 3 governesses. But yesterday you reached him. He took the branch. He listened to you. I will pay you whatever you ask. Name your price. I wish for you to come to Grimsby Park and take up the position." The room was utterly still. Cecily could feel her sister's wide, hopeful eyes on her, could feel George practically vibrating with greed. This was it. The miracle they had been waiting for. A lifeline thrown from the gilded fortress on the hill. All she had to do was say yes. But the words tasted like ash. He was not offering her a position. He was trying to buy her. He was trying to turn an act of simple human decency into a transaction. He spoke of it as a debt, and he was offering to settle it with coin and employment, as if she were a horse he was buying for his stable. Self-sufficient. The word for a horse that does not need to be fed. She lifted her chin, her own gray eyes meeting his, and for the first time she did not care about being sensible or useful. "No," she said. The word fell into the silent room like a stone. Her sister gasped. George made a strangled sound of protest. The Duke himself looked taken aback, his composure faltering for the first time. A faint line appeared between his brows. "A no?" he repeated, as if he had misheard. "Before I answer anything, you will tell me the truth." "All of it," Cecily said, her voice quiet, but carrying a sudden, unexpected weight of authority. "I do not bargain with half a story. You are not looking for a companion, Your Grace. You are looking for a warden for your son's grief. You want someone to manage it, to keep it quiet and tidy, so it does not disturb the running of your great house. You want to pay me to do what you cannot." The Duke stared at her. The air crackled with a tension so thick she could feel it on her skin. She had overstepped. She had spoken a truth that a man of his rank was never meant to hear, least of all from a woman of none. She expected anger, a cold dismissal. She expected him to turn on his heel and leave, her one chance at escape gone forever. Instead, Something shifted in his expression. The surprise gave way to a flicker of respect. He was seeing her. Truly seeing her, not as a poor relation or a village spinster, but as a person. "And if I were to disagree with your assessment," he asked, his voice dangerously soft. Then you would be lying," she said simply. "And I have no interest in serving a liar, Your Grace, no matter the wage." She held his gaze, her heart pounding, Saz, refusing to be the first to look away. This was a precipice, and she was either about to fall or to fly. He was silent for a long, fraught moment. Then he gave a single sharp nod, a gesture of concession. The position as I have described it is unacceptable to you," he stated. "It was not a question." "Oh, it is," she confirmed. Then what is acceptable?" This was her moment. The moment to set terms. Not for money, not for status, but for dignity. "I will not enter your house as a hired servant to be ignored until needed," she began, her voice gaining strength. If I come to help your son. That means I will have full authority over the nursery and his education. No interference. Not from you, and not from your staff." He listened, his expression unreadable. "A second," she continued. We will not pretend. His mother did not exist. Her memory is not a disease to be cured. His grief is not an inconvenience to be managed. It is a measure of his love. We will honor it. We will speak her name. We will remember her odd." She saw a flicker of pain in his eyes at that, raw and deep. But he did not flinch. "And third," she said, her voice dropping, the anger draining away to be replaced by a simple profound weariness. "I will not accept a wage as a reward for saving your Sona's life. My actions on the ice yesterday are not for sale. If I come to Grimsby Park, I will be paid a fair salary for my work as a companion, and not a shilling more. I am not a debt to be settled, Your Grace." She finished, her breath catching in her throat. She had laid her soul bare. She had demanded respect from a man who could buy and sell her entire world 10 times over. She had given him every reason to walk away. Crispin looked at the woman before him. He had come here this morning to discharge an obligation, to restore order to his world by settling a debt. He had expected gratitude, perhaps some polite haggling over terms. He had not expected this. He had not expected to be met with an unbending will, with an honesty so brutal and clear it was like a slap in the face. She had read him, his motives, his failings, with terrifying accuracy. She was not afraid of him. In a world where everyone either feared his power or coveted it, this woman, with nothing to her name but a worn coat and an unshakable sense of her own worth, was not afraid of him. He had come to hire a governess. He was beginning to realize he had found something else entirely. Your terms are unorthodox," he said slowly. My terms are my terms," she replied, her chin still high. He looked around the small, shabby kitchen again. He saw the life she was being offered as an alternative, a life of being slowly ground down by poverty and petty resentments. And he looked at her, at the fierce intelligence in her eyes, the quiet dignity in her bearing. Very well, Miss Thorne," he said. "The decision made. I agree to all of it." A collective sigh of relief came from her sister. But Cecily did not relax. She simply watched him, her expression guarded. You will have full authority," he affirmed. We will speak her name, and your salary will be that of a companion. Nothing more. When can you be ready?" The question was so sudden, so practical, it almost threw her. I would need a day," she stammered. Be at Grimsby Park tomorrow before noon," he said. He gave a stiff, formal bow that was directed at her, and her alone. Then, without another word, he turned and was gone, leaving a vortex of stunned silence in his wake. The moment the door closed, the room erupted. Her sister was weeping with joy. George was crowing, clapping his hands together. You did it, Cecily. By God, you did it. A position with the Duke. But Cecily felt no triumph. She felt only a profound and terrifying sense of dislocation. She had stepped off the precipice. She looked down at her hands, half expecting to see them trembling. They were perfectly still. She had won. She had faced the Duke of Grimsby and bent him to her will. So, why did it feel as though she had just locked herself in a cage of her own making? Grimsby Park was not a house. It was a statement of power, written in pale, unforgiving stone. As the carriage crunched up the long winding drive the next day, Cecily felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. The house did not welcome. It loomed. It was a place that counted its candles. She thought a place where warmth was a resource to be managed, not a quality to be enjoyed. She was met at the door. Not by the Duke, but by the housekeeper, Mrs. Finch. The woman's face was a study in disapproval. She had clearly been informed of Cecilia's unorthodox terms, and her resentment was a palpable force. Miss Thorne," she said, her voice as starched as her apron, "His Grace is engaged with his steward. I am to show you to your rooms, A." She led Cecily through the echoing grand hall, her footsteps loud on the marble floor. The air was cold, smelling of beeswax and something else, a faint, lingering scent of sorrow. Portraits of dead ancestors stared down from the walls, their expressions uniformly severe. There were fires in the hearths, but they were small, grudging flames that seemed to consume the heat rather than radiate it. The house was frozen. It was a physical manifestation of the man who owned it. Cecilia's rooms were in the east wing, overlooking the formal gardens, which were currently a bleak tableau of frosted hedges and bare rose bushes. The suite was larger than the entire ground floor of her sister-in-law's cottage, furnished with heavy, dark mahogany and silk draperies the color of dried blood. It was luxurious, but it was profoundly unwelcoming. It was a gilded cage. The young master's rooms are at the end of this corridor," Mrs. Finch said, her lips barely moving. He has not left them since the accident. He refuses his meals. She said it with a hint of satisfaction, as if Cecilia's failure was already a foregone conclusion. The Duke expects you to begin immediately. With that, she turned and left, leaving Cecily alone in the opulent silence. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had made her bargain. Now she had to live up to it. She walked down the corridor, the thick carpet swallowing the sound of her footsteps. The door to Arthur's room was closed. She knocked softly. There was no answer. She knocked again, a little louder. "Arthur, it is Miss Thorne. May I come in?" Silence. She tried the handle. It was not locked. She pushed the door open a crack and peered inside. The room was dark, the heavy curtains drawn tight against the morning light. A single candle flickered on a table, casting long, dancing shadows. The boy was sitting on the floor in the far corner, his back to the door, his knees drawn up to his chest. He was utterly still. Cecily did not enter. She remembered her promise. She would not force anything. She simply stood in the doorway. "A was thinking of opening the curtains," she said, her voice calm and conversational. "It is a bright morning. Your mother loved the winter sun, I am told." She had learned that from the village gossip, one of the few useful things it had ever produced. The late Duchess had loved the crisp light of a winter's day. At the mention of his mother, the boy's shoulders stiffened, a barely perceptible movement, but he did not turn. He did not speak. Very well," Cecily said softly. Perhaps later." She pulled the door almost closed, leaving it open just a sliver, and went back to her own room. She sat in a hard-backed chair by the window, not unpacking, and waited. She did not know what she was waiting for. An hour later a maid brought a lunch tray for Arthur. Cecily intercepted her. "I'll take that," she said. She placed the tray on the floor outside Arthur's door, knocked once, and said, "I've left some food here for you, Arthur, if you are hungry." Then she walked away. The day passed in a series of these small, quiet encounters with silence. Cecily did not push. She did not cajole. She simply made her presence known. a quiet, steady orbit around the boya's closed world. She learned quickly that the house was watching her. Maids would fall silent when she entered a room. Footmen observed her from a distance. She was an anomaly, an outsider, who had been granted an inexplicable authority, and the household did not know what to make of her. Late in the afternoon, she saw the Duke, for the first time since her arrival. He was walking across the lawn with his steward, a tall, imposing figure against the gray sky. He looked up toward the house, his gaze sweeping the windows of the east wing. For a moment, she was certain. His eyes met hers. She saw the question in them. Have you failed yet? She stepped back from the window, her heart giving a small, traitorous flutter. Her most immediate antagonist, however, was not the silent child or the distant Duke, but his sister. Lady Honoria Vane arrived that evening, ostensibly to check on her nephew, but Cecily knew a reconnaissance mission when she saw one. She was a handsome woman in her late 30s, with her brother's height, but none of his restraint. Her eyes were sharp and perpetually disapproving. Cecily was in the small family library, looking for a book for herself, when Lady Honoria found her. "Ah, so you are the one," she said, her voice carrying a distinct note of condescending amusement. She circled Cecily as if inspecting a horse. "Ah, the village hero. My brother is impressionable when it comes to the boy. He is prone to grand, sentimental gestures. I trust you will not take advantage of his momentary lapse in judgment. I am here to be a companion to your nephew, Lady Honoria," Cecily said, her voice even. She refused to be baited. A companion," Lady Honoria repeated, her lips twisting into a faint sneer. That is a rather generous title for a governess, is it not? Especially one with no references." The crime was that she had been chosen first. That was the heart of it. This woman with her title and her silk dress could not bear that the Duke had turned to a nobody from the village instead of to her. My only concern is for Arthur's welfare," Cecily said, turning back to the bookshelf. Is it?" A Lady Honoria murmured, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Or is your concern for the Grimsby fortune? A clever girl can go far, starting as a companion. My brother is a lonely man, a very, very wealthy, lonely man. The insult was so blatant, so perfectly aimed, that it almost took Cecilia's breath away. The question echoed in her mind. Guilty of being poor, guilty of being present, guilty of being chosen, and if I were to disagree with your assessment, Cecily asked, her voice dangerously quiet, echoing the Duke's own words back at his sister. Lady Honoria laughed, a short, sharp sound, with no warmth in it. "Oh, my dear, it does not matter if you disagree, it only matters what society believes. And a woman in your position must be so very, very careful of her reputation." She let the threat hang in the air, then swept from the room, leaving behind the scent of expensive perfume and malice. Cecily stood very still, her hand resting on the spine of a leather-bound book. She had known this would be difficult. She had not understood that it would be a war. She was surrounded by enemies, a resentful staff, a hostile relative, a silent, grieving child, and a Duke who watched her from a distance, waiting for her to fail. She returned to her wing of the house, to find a lunch tray still sitting outside Arthur's door. Untouched, her heart sank. She had made a terrible mistake. She had traded a life of quiet misery for one of open warfare, and she was utterly alone. She picked up the tray and carried it away, the weight of the uneaten food feeling like a judgment against her. She had promised she could help him. But what if she could not? What if the boy-ass grief was a fortress she could never breach? That night, she could not sleep. The silence of the great house pressed in on her. She got up and walked to the window, looking out at the moonlit garden. The frost had painted everything in silver. It was beautiful, but it was the beauty of a tomb. She thought of Arthur, alone in his dark room. She thought of the Duke, alone in his. A house full of ghosts, and she had just volunteered to become one of them. She traced a single looping, a K, on the frosted pane of glass. It hung there for a moment, a fragile mark of her existence, before the warmth of her own breath made it weep and disappear. Days bled into a week, and the Cold War continued. Cecily maintained her patient quiet. Every morning she would greet him at his closed door. Every mealtime, she would leave a tray. She found a book of engraved birds in the library and would leave it open to a new page outside his room each day, a silent offering. The trays remained untouched. The book was never moved. The door remained closed. Crispin watched. He did not mean to, but he found his path bending toward the east wing. He would see her from his study window, walking in the frozen garden, her posture straight, her expression thoughtful. He would hear her quiet voice in the corridor, a low, steady murmur against the unyielding silence of his Sonus room. Every other governess had lasted 3 days before demanding he force the boy to comply. They had tried bribery, then threats, then had dissolved into frustrated tears. Miss Thorne did none of those things. She simply stayed. He saw the trays of food coming back, untouched. He saw the way his sister Honoria looked at Cecily, her eyes glittering with a venomous dislike. He saw the quiet insolence of the staff, the way a footman would be slow to answer her bell, the way Mrs. Finch seemed to find fault in everything she did. And he saw that Cecily absorbed it all without complaint, her composure a suit of impenetrable armor. He had made a bargain with her. Given her authority, he should intervene, enforce her position. But some instinct held him back. This was a test, not just for her, but for him. He wanted to see what she would do. He was a man who had walled himself off from feeling, but he found himself feeling a reluctant, grudging admiration, and something else. A flicker of warmth in the frozen landscape of his own heart. He found himself inventing reasons to speak with her. He requested a report on Arthur's progress, knowing full well there was none. She met him in the library, the same room where his sister had confronted her. "Ah, there is no progress to report, Your Grace," she said, her voice flat. She did not try to soften the truth. "Ah, he does not speak. He does not eat. He does not leave his room. Perhaps your methods are too gentle," he suggested, testing her. "Perhaps," she agreed, her gaze unwavering. Or perhaps grief does not yield to force. Oz. The words were a quiet rebuke, aimed at him as much as at the failed governesses. He had been trying to force his own grief into submission for 2 years, and all it had done was leave him hollow. "Oh, what will you do?" he asked. It was a genuine question. He, the Duke of Grimsby, was asking this penniless spinster for a strategy. "A will wait," she said. "A patience is the only tool I have left. Men do not always care to be seen." But in that moment, Crispin felt as though she had looked straight through the wall he had built around himself and seen the exhausted man within. It was an uncomfortable sensation, and yet he did not want her to stop. The breakthrough, when it came, was not a grand moment. It was a small, quiet thing, as fragile as a bird's egg. Cecily had been exploring the vast, underused rooms of the house, and had come across the late Duchess' morning room. It had been locked. Mrs. Finch had stiffly informed her that the Duke had ordered it closed after his wife's death. Cecily went directly to him. She found him in his study, buried under a mountain of estate papers. I require the key to the Duchess's morning room," she said, without preamble. He looked up, his expression hardening. "That room is to remain closed. You gave me full authority over matters concerning your son," she reminded him gently. His grief is connected to his mother. Hiding all trace of her is not helping him. It is telling him his memories are shameful. He stared at her, a muscle tightening in his jaw. She was trespassing on the most sacred, painful ground. No one had dared mention Eleanor's name to him in 2 years. Honor the dead. It had been her condition. He had agreed to it. With a sigh that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul, he unlocked a small drawer in his desk and took out a single ornate brass key. He held it out to her. "Do not make me regret this, Miss Thorne." I have no intention of doing so, Your Grace, she said, taking the key. The room was just as the Duchess had left it. A layer of dust covered everything, but it was otherwise untouched. A book of poetry lay open on a table. A half-finished piece of embroidery sat in a hoop, the needle still threaded. And on a small desk by the window was a large, leather-bound album. Cecily opened it. It was a book of pressed flowers, each one meticulously mounted and labeled in a fine, elegant hand. Winter aconite, from the South Lawn. Snowdrop, found by the lake house edge. Christmas rose, a gift from C. A gift from Crispin. She took the album and went to Arthur's room. She did not knock. She opened the door and walked in, placing the book on the floor in the center of the room, open to a page displaying a delicate, perfectly preserved sprig of jasmine. "Eh, this was your mother saw," she said to the boyas, unmoving back Sondo. "Did you know?" As she sat on the floor a respectful distance away and began to turn the pages, her voice a low murmur. This one is a Lenten rose. It blooms even when there is still snow on the ground." She called it a hopeful flower, She continued for nearly an hour, simply describing the flowers, reading his mother's notes aloud. Arthur did not move. He gave no sign that he was listening. Finally, Cecily closed the book. "That is enough for today," she said softly. She stood up to leave. As she reached the door, a tiny voice, hoarse from disuse, broke the silence. As she liked the white ones best, Cecily froze her hand on the doorknob. She did not dare to turn, did not dare to breathe, for fear of frightening the moment away. The white ones," she repeated, her own voice barely a whisper, like the snowdrops. Yes," he said, just that one word. She turned slowly. He had not moved from his corner, but his head was lifted, and he was looking at her. His eyes, so long clouded with a silent, stubborn grief, were clear. A wave of emotion so powerful it was dizzying washed over her. It was not triumph, it was relief, profound and overwhelming. She had reached him. Through the wall of his silence, she had found a door. Thank you for telling me," she said, her voice thick. She left the room, closing the door gently behind her. She walked to the great window at the end of the hall and pressed her forehead against the cold glass, her legs suddenly weak. She had done it. That evening, when she brought his tray, she knocked. The door opened a crack. A small hand snaked out and took the plate of sandwiches from the tray before the door closed again. Cecily leaned against the wall, a slow smile spreading across her face. It was a beginning. Crispin found her there a few minutes later. He had heard the news from a stunned and disbelieving footman. The young master had spoken. The young master had eaten. He saw the empty space on the tray, and then he looked at Cecilia's face, at the quiet, luminous joy in her eyes. He spoke, Crispin said, the words feeling inadequate. She nodded, her smile fading to something more tremulous. He said. His mother liked the white flowers best. He had come to feel an intellectual respect for her, an admiration for her resilience. But looking at her now, at the genuine, unselfish happiness on her face, he felt something else. A warmth that spread through his chest, melting a shard of ice he had not even known was there. He had thought to hire a servant, and instead, this quiet, stubborn woman was slowly, patiently bringing his house and his son back to life. "I did not expect he began, then stopped, unsure what he meant to say. "I did not expect to care whether you stayed. I did not expect you to succeed. I did not expect you to make me feel anything at all." No," she said softly. And he had the unnerving feeling that she understood him perfectly. Thank you, Cecily," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. It felt both strange and perfectly natural on his tongue. He saw a faint blush rise on her cheeks, the first crack in her own formidable composure. In that shared, quiet moment in the corridor, with the scent of the untouched dinner tray still lingering in the air, the foundation of their bargain shifted. It was no longer a contract. It was becoming something else, something fragile and unnamed, and it terrified them both. The thaw, once begun, continued, in subtle, incremental ways. Arthur began to leave his room, at first just to sit with Cecily as she read from his mother's flower album. Then he started to speak more, asking questions about the flowers, sharing small, fragmented memories of his mother. He was a solemn, intelligent child, his grief still a palpable presence, but the stubborn, silent wall had crumbled. Cecily learned the shape of his specific wound. The late Duchess, Eleanor, had loved the winter. She had loved to skate. Her final illness, a fierce inflammation of the lungs, had begun with a chill she caught on the ice, skating with Arthur. In his childish mind, a terrible magical equation had formed. His mother had died because of something they both loved. He had gone out on the lake, not to play, but as a form of penance, drawn to the site of his guilt. His silence was a punishment, directed at himself. Cecily did not try to reason him out of it. Logic was useless against the deep, irrational convictions of grief. Instead, she simply listened. She let him talk about his mother, about her laughter echoing over the ice, about the way she would cut winter jasmine to bring into the house. She helped him see that the memory of his mother's joy was a gift, not a curse. The house itself seemed to be breathing again. Cecily, using the authority the Duke had given her, had the curtains drawn back in the main rooms, letting the pale winter sunlight stream in. She ordered fires to be built up, great, roaring blazes that pushed back the perpetual chill. The staff, seeing the undeniable change in the young master, began to treat her with a grudging respect. Even Mrs. Finchaw's disapproval seemed to lose some of its sharp edge, and Crispin began to change too. He started leaving his study door open. He would appear for dinner in the small family dining room, instead of taking a tray alone. He would watch, mostly in silence, as Cecily and Arthur talked quietly about their day. He was a man emerging from a long, dark tunnel, blinking in an unfamiliar light. His observation of her sharpened, became more focused. He noticed the way her hands, though often busy with mending or turning the page of a book, were always graceful. He noticed the thread of dry, quiet wit that ran through her conversation when she was relaxed. He noticed the way she would look at Arthur, her expression a complex mixture of tenderness, concern, and fierce protectiveness. One evening, he sought her out in the library after Arthur had gone to bed. She was reading, a small pair of spectacles perched on her nose. She looked up as he entered, a slight surprise on her face. She looked tired, he thought. The strain of the past weeks was etched in faint lines around her eyes. Hope, I am not disturbing you," he said. Not at all, Your Grace," she said, removing her spectacles. A Crispin," he corrected her, the name still feeling new. My name is Crispin." A faint blush touched her cheeks. A Crispin," she repeated softly. He walked over to the fire, staring into the flames. He did not know why he had come. He only knew that the silence of his study had become unbearable, and he had been drawn here, to her quiet presence. At this house, it has been cold for a long time. He said, the confession costing him more than he would have thought. I had forgotten what it was like to hear laughter in it. Arthur had laughed that afternoon, a real, bubbling laugh at something Cecily had said. The sound had stopped Crispin in his tracks. It is a good sound, she said. Yes. He turned from the fire to look at her. It is all your doing. You have worked a miracle with him. It was not a miracle, she said, her gaze serious. It was patience, and it was Arthur's own strength. He is a remarkable boy. He is his mother's son, he said, and the name Eleanor did not stick in his throat. It was a simple statement of fact, sad but not agonizing. He realized, with a jolt, that Cecily had given him that. She had given him back his wife's memory, not as a source of pain, but as a source of love for his son. An easy silence fell between them, the kind that exists only between people who are comfortable in each other's company. He had been lonely for so long, a profound, isolating loneliness that his rank and power only amplified. But in this moment, sitting in the warm, firelit library, With this quiet, intelligent woman, he did not feel lonely at all. The feeling was so new, so unnerving, that it sent a jolt of alarm through him. This was not part of the bargain. He had hired her to care for his son. He had not expected her to become the still, quiet center of his own world. He had not expected to need her. The realization sent him retreating back behind his wall of ducal reserve. He cleared his throat, the moment of connection broken. "I merely came to thank you for your continued efforts, Miss Thorne," he said, his voice once again formal and distant. "A good night." He left the library without looking back, leaving Cecily staring after him, a confused, hurt expression on her face. The warmth of the moment had vanished, leaving the air cold and empty. She had felt something shift between them, a fragile tendril of connection, and he had deliberately, decisively, crushed it. She put her spectacles back on and picked up her book, but the words on the page were a meaningless blur. The cage, she thought, was still a cage, no matter how beautifully gilded. Lady Honoria Vane watched the slow transformation of Grimsby Park with a growing sense of alarm. The house was brighter. Her nephew was no longer a silent ghost, but a boy who smiled and spoke. And her brother's brother was beginning to look at the governess. She saw it in the small moments, the way his eyes would follow Cecily as she crossed a room, the way he would linger after dinner, listening to her talk. Honoria had plans for her brother, a suitable, advantageous second marriage to a woman of impeccable family and fortune, an alliance that would strengthen the Grimsby name. The presence of this quiet, clever nobody from the village was a threat to all of it. Cecily Thorne was not just a governess, she was an obstacle that needed to be removed. Honoria was a patient woman. She gathered her ammunition slowly. She sent quiet inquiries to contacts in London. She learned of the disgrace of Cecilia's father, the solicitor who had lost a fortune through bad investments and died in debt. She learned of the family's subsequent poverty, of their fall from grace. It was the perfect weapon, a story of a desperate, scheming young woman from a ruined family, targeting a wealthy, grieving duke. She chose her moment carefully. A small, formal dinner party Crispin was hosting for some influential neighbors and trustees of the estate. It was the first time he had entertained in 2 years, a significant step back into the world, and Honoria knew it was the perfect stage for her drama. Cecily had not wanted to attend. "I am a companion, not a guest," she had protested. But Crispin had been insistent. "You are part of this household. Cecily, I want you there." Reluctantly, she had agreed. She wore her one good dress, a simple gown of dark green silk that she had made herself years ago. It was hopelessly out of fashion, but it was all she had. She entered the drawing room feeling like a sparrow in a flock of peacocks. The other women were adorned in jewels and vibrant London silks. Their laughter pitched a shade too loud. Honoria descended upon her at once, her smile a predatory slash of red. My dear Miss Thorne," she purred, her voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. How brave of you to join us. We were just discussing the perils of fortune hunters. It is remarkable what some women will do to secure a position, is it not?" The nearby conversation faltered, heads turned. Cecily felt a hot blush creep up her neck. This was it. The attack she had been dreading. "I am sure I would not know, Lady Honoria," Cecily said, her voice quiet. I think you might," Honoria pressed on, sensing her advantage. She turned to the group. "A Miss Thorne's story is quite the fairy tale. A poor girl from the village, father disgraced by debt, who cleverly manages to ingratiate herself into the Duca's household by way of a fortunate accident." The implication was ugly and clear, that she had somehow orchestrated Arthur's fall. A collective gasp went through the small circle of listeners. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. "My father's financial misfortunes are a matter of public record," Cecily said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to control it. They are also a matter of private grief. And I assure you, there was nothing unfortunate about watching a child, nearly drown, her past weaponized against her. The words landed like blows. Crispin, who had been speaking with a trustee across the room, heard the shift in tone. He turned and saw the scene. His sister, poised and triumphant, the circle of avid, shocked faces, and Cecily, standing alone, pale but defiant, in the center of their hostile attention. He moved toward them, his face a thunderous mask. "Honoria," he said, his voice dangerously low. That is enough." Oh, I am only trying to protect you, brother," she said, feigning innocence. This woman's background is questionable. We know nothing about her, except that her family is desperate. One must be cautious." All eyes were now on Crispin. They were waiting to see what he would do. Would he defend the upstart governess, or would he side with his own sister, his own class? Cecily held her breath. She looked at him, her heart in her eyes, silently pleading with him. He was torn. On one side was his sister, his family, the rigid expectations of his world. On the other was Cecily, the woman who had saved his son, the woman who had brought light back into his house, the woman he was beginning to trough for. He hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. "And Miss Thornia's service to this household has been exemplary," he said, finally, his voice stiff and formal. Her background is of no concern." The words were meant as a defense, but they landed like an insult. Service. Exemplary. He had reduced her to an employee. He had defended her utility, not her character. He had chosen the safe ducal response, and in doing so he had utterly failed her. The pain on her face was so clear, so profound, it was like a physical blow. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head, then turned and walked from the room, her back ramrod straight. The silent, dignified exit was a more powerful condemnation than any words she could have spoken. The party dissolved soon after in a flurry of polite excuses. Crispin was left alone in the drawing room with his sister. "Ah, you see," Honoria said, triumphant. She cannot handle the pressure. She is not one of us." Get out," he said, his voice shaking with a rage he had not felt in years. Get out of my house." Honoria's triumphant expression faltered Crispin. "I was only trying to help. You were trying to destroy a good and decent woman for your own selfish reasons," he snarled. "Now leave. And do not come back until you are prepared to beg for her forgiveness." Stunned into silence, Honoria gathered her wrap and swept out, her fury radiating from her. Crispin stood alone in the silent room, the wreckage of the evening around him. He had failed. He had seen Cecily under attack, and he had hesitated. He had offered a weak, lukewarm defense when she had deserved his unequivocal support. He had let her walk out of that room alone. He went in search of her, his heart pounding with a terrible urgency. He found her in her room, not weeping, but packing. Why? Her few belongings were being placed neatly into a small traveling case. "Oh, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice raw. "I am leaving." "Your Grace," she said, not looking at him. It was the cold, dead voice of someone who had been hurt, beyond caring. You cannot leave," he said desperately. "Arthur needs you." She finally looked at him then, and her eyes were filled with a calm, devastating clarity. "Do not hide behind your son, Your Grace. Not now. You needed a governess. You will find another. It is not about Arthur," he said, the truth forcing its way out. "Not only about him. I need you to stay." It was a half-confession, torn from him by the threat of her departure. He had said the words, "I need you." She looked at him for a long, silent moment, her expression unreadable. Why?" she asked simply. "As an exemplary servant? As a buffer against your loneliness? For what purpose do you need me?" Crispin. He had no answer. The words of love, of belonging, of everything she had come to mean to him, were locked behind a lifetime of reserve and fear. He could not say them. Was wrong. He said, instead. "The admission ragged what? I said downstairs. It was cowardly. I am sorry." Yes, she said, her voice quiet. You were. She turned back to her packing. It does not change anything. I cannot stay in a house where I am seen as a target and where my employer will not defend me. I will defend you, he promised, stepping closer. I swear it. I will not fail you again. Promises are easy to make in private, she said, snapping the lid of her case shut. They are harder to keep in public. Good night, Your Grace. She picked up her case. He stood between her and the door, a desperate, pleading expression on his face. He looked, she thought, with a strange detachment, like a man who was watching his own house burn down. Cicely, please, he whispered. Adonat, go. The genuine anguish in his voice gave her pause. But the wound was too fresh, the humiliation too deep. She could not stay. Not like this. She moved to step around him. The battle was over. Lady Honoria had won. The next morning, a formal letter arrived for the Duke. It was from the solicitors representing the trustees of the Grimsby estate, one of whom had been a guest at the disastrous dinner party. The letter expressed grave concern over the enunciable influenza of a Miss Cecily Thorne on the young heir, and, by extension, on the Duke himself. It strongly, almost threateningly, advised that her employment be terminated immediately for the sake of propriety and the boy's welfare. Lady Honoria had not wasted any time. She had turned her social assassination into a legal threat. Crispin read the letter, a cold fury settling over him. They were trying to control him, to dictate the terms of his own life, his own household. They were using his son as a weapon against him. And they were going to drive Cecily away for good. He found her in the nursery, which was quiet and orderly. She had not left. Her traveling case was gone from her room, but he knew she was only delaying her departure until a carriage could be arranged. She was sitting with Arthur, a book open between them, but neither of them was reading. Arthur's face was pale and anxious. He knew she was leaving. He had one small hand clutching the fabric of her sleeve, as if he could physically anchor her there. Cecily looked up as Crispin entered. Her face was composed, but her eyes were shadowed with exhaustion and sorrow. They are trying to force you out, he said, holding up the letter, the trustees. Honoria has been busy. She glanced at the letter, her expression unsurprised. I expected as much. I will not let them, he said, his voice fierce. This is my house, my son. My life. It is not that simple. And you know it, she said wearily. They have power over the estate, over Arthur's inheritance. A battle with them would be long and ugly. It would drag your name, and mine, through the mud. It is not worth it. I will leave. It is the cleanest solution. There is no clean solution that involves you leaving this house, he said, his voice dropping. He looked at Arthur, at the boy's white-knuckled grip on her sleeve. He looked at Cecily, at the quiet dignity that had not buckled even under his sister's vicious assault, and in that moment, he knew what he had to do. The fear, the hesitation, the lifetime of ducal reserve, all fell away. There was only the stark, terrifying clarity of what he was about to lose. There will be a meeting, he said, his mind racing. In the main drawing room, this afternoon. The trustees might, sister you, will be there. For what purpose? She asked. A flicker of alarm in her eyes. To be put on trial? To end this? He said. For good. The drawing room that afternoon was a tribunal. The two trustees, Mr. Henderson and Lord Ashworth, sat on one side of the fireplace, their faces grim and judgmental. Lady Honoria sat opposite them, looking poised and confident. She believed she had already won. Crispin stood by the mantelpiece, a commanding, formidable figure. He had summoned Cecily, who stood near the door, a silent, pale observer. She felt like a prisoner awaiting her sentence. We are here. Mr. Henderson began, his voice pompous, to discuss a matter of great sensitivity regarding the welfare of the heir and the reputation of this house. He cleared his throat, preparing to launch into a prepared speech about propriety and unsuitable influences. Crispin cut him off. No, we are not here to discuss anything. We are here because you have been misled by a campaign of malicious gossip, and I am going to set the record straight. Then you are all going to leave my house. The room fell silent. No one had ever spoken to the trustees this way. My sister A. Crispin said, turning his cold gaze on Honoria, has led you to believe that Miss Thorne is a fortune hunter who has somehow schemed her way into this house. She has painted a picture of a desperate woman from a ruined family, preying on a grieving widower. He paused, letting the ugly words hang in the air. Honoria shifted uncomfortably in her chair. The truth, Crispin continued, his voice ringing with authority, is that Miss Thorne is the woman who pulled my son from a frozen lake when he was seconds from death. The truth is that she walked into a house, frozen by grief, and with nothing but patience and kindness, brought my silent son back to the world. She did what no doctor, no tutor, and none of you could do. She gave me back my son, A. He looked at Cecily, his eyes holding hers. She has asked for nothing. She has endured insults and suspicion. She has been treated not as a savior but as a servant. And my great failing is that I allowed it to happen. That I stood by in silence when she was attacked in my own home. He turned back to the stunned trustees. You speak of her unsuitable influence. Her influence has been to bring warmth and light and healing to a house that was dying. If that is unsuitable, then I pray for more of it. It was a powerful speech. But Cecily knew it was not enough. It was his word against his sister's. It changed nothing. Admirable sentiment, brother, Honoria said, recovering her composure. But it does not change the facts of her background. She is not one of us. She does not belong here. And who are Honoria, Cecilia's voice, though quiet, cut through the room. It was the first time she had spoken. All heads turned to her, as a people who stand by and watch a child sink into silence, the people who value a name more than a life, the people who use gossip as a weapon and call it concern. She took a step forward, her fear gone, replaced by a cold, clear anger. You question my motives, let me question yours. You do not care about Arthur. You care about controlling your brother and his fortune. An accusation of fortune hunting is not proof, Lady Honoria. It is merely the most convenient slander to hand. Her unexpected knowledge, her calm use of a legalistic phrase, seemed to momentarily unbalance her accuser. She does belong here. The voice was small, but it rang out in the silent room with the force of a trumpet blast. Arthur stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes blazing. He must have followed Cecily from the nursery. He walked into the center of the room, straight to Cecilia's side, and took her hand. She belongs here, he repeated, looking directly at the trustees, then at his aunt. She's the only one who talks about Mama. She said, my memories of Mama were a gift. He turned his gaze on his father. She made the house warm again. Then he looked up at Cecily, his small face filled with a fierce, desperate love. Please do not go, he whispered, his voice breaking. Please stay. Mama would have wanted you to stay. It was the final devastating blow. The truth, spoken from the mouth of a child. The room was utterly silent. Lady Honoria's face had gone white. The trustees looked deeply uncomfortable, their pompous certainty shattered. Crispin crossed the room in 3 long strides. He knelt before his son, his own eyes shining with unshed tears. She is not going anywhere, Arthur, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Then he stood and faced the room, his hand resting on his Sona's shoulder, his other hand reaching out unhesitatingly to take Cecilia's. He laced his fingers through hers, a public, undeniable declaration. Miss Thorne is not my employee, he announced, his voice ringing with a final absolute authority. Senda, she is to be my wife. She is to be the next Duchess of Grimsby. She is the woman who stayed, and she will stay here, with me and with my son, for the rest of her life. Now, he said, his gaze sweeping over his sister and the trustees, cold and dismissive, I believe I asked you all to leave. The battle was over. The room emptied in a state of shocked, humbled silence. Lady Honoria was the last to go, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. The door closed behind her, and they were alone. The three of them, a family, forged in a crucible of grief and accusation. Cecily looked at Crispin, at their joined hands, at the sleeping boy he now held in his arms. He had not just defended her, he had claimed her, in front of everyone, he had made her belong. And she did not know if her heart could bear the weight of it. Later, after Arthur had been put to bed, exhausted but happy, Crispin found Cecily in the library. The fire was burning low, casting a warm, gentle light over the room. She was standing by the window, looking out into the darkness, her arms wrapped around herself, as if to hold herself together. He came to stand beside her, the silence between them charged with all the things that had been said, and all the things that had not. What you said this afternoon," she began, her voice barely a whisper. About making me your wife? You did not have to do that. It was a grand gesture to save the situation. I do not expect you to hold to it. It was not a gesture," he said, his voice low and serious. And it was not to save the situation. It was to save myself." She turned to look at him then, her eyes searching his face in the dim light. "I don't understand." He took a deep breath, the confession he had been unable to make before, now rising to his lips, raw and honest. "For 2 years, this house has been a tomb, and I have been its keeper. I thought my only duty was to preserve Eleanor's memory, to lock everything down, to feel nothing. I was a coward, Cecily. I was afraid that if I felt anything again, the grief would destroy me. He reached out his hand, gently touching her arm. Her skin was warm beneath the thin fabric of her sleeve. Then you came, you walked onto the ice. You walked into this cold, dead house, and you were not afraid. You were not afraid of the silence, or the grief, or of me. You taught my son how to remember his mother with love instead of guilt. And you made me feel again." His voice broke on the last words. "I thought I was offering you a position, a way to settle a debt. I did not realize I was asking you to save me." Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his face. "Oh, Crispin," she whispered. I need you," he said, the words no longer pressured or desperate, but a simple, profound statement of fact, and not as a governess, not as a companion. I need you, because somewhere between the frozen lake and this moment, I have fallen in love with you. The declaration, so plain and unadorned, was more powerful than any poetic verse. But her own deep-seated wound, the belief that she was useful but never wanted, made her pull back. "Do not say it if it is only gratitude," she said, her voice thick with tears. I could not bear it, if it is only gratitude for what I did for Arthur." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. His gray eyes, once so cold and distant, were filled with a warmth that seemed to light her from the inside out. "Is it gratitude that I cannot bear the thought of a day in this house without you in it?" he asked softly. "Is it gratitude that the sound of your voice in the corridor is the only thing I have wanted to hear? Is it gratitude that when my sister attacked you, it felt as though she had put a knife in my own heart?" He shook his head, a small, sad smile on his lips. "No, Cecily, it is not gratitude. It is love. A love I did not believe I would ever feel again. I love you for your courage, for your honesty, for the quiet, unshakable strength that you wear like armor. I love you." How he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a practiced, polished kiss. It was clumsy and searching, and profoundly real. It was a kiss of homecoming, of two lonely, shipwrecked souls, finding a safe harbor in each other. When he finally pulled away, she was breathless, her heart singing a song she had never thought she would hear. "I love you too, she whispered, and the words were an admission, a surrender, a victory, all at once. She had walked into a house full of ghosts and found not just a home, but a love that was real and true. The bargain was finally, blessedly dissolved, replaced by something infinitely more precious. Spring came to Grimsby Park, not as a tentative visitor, but as a joyful resident. The formal gardens, once bleak and frosted, erupted in a riot of color. Daffodils and crocuses pushed their way through the damp earth, and the bare branches of the rose bushes were covered in the green haze of new leaves. The house, too, had come to life. The grand rooms were filled with sunlight and the scent of fresh flowers which Cecily now cut from the garden herself. The sound of Arthur's laughter was a frequent and welcome music in the corridors. 6 months had passed since the drawing-room confrontation, 6 months since Crispin's declaration. They had been married quietly, a small ceremony in the estate's chapel, with only Arthur and a few trusted servants as witnesses. Cecily was now the Duchess of Grimsby, a title that still felt strange and ill-fitting, like a dress made for someone else. But the title was not the point. The point was the quiet joy she found in her new life. The point was waking up each morning to find Crispin beside her, his face soft in sleep, his arm thrown protectively over her. The point was walking in the garden with Arthur, his hand tucked confidently in hers, as he pointed out the flowers his mother had loved. The point was the easy, companionable silences she shared with her husband in the library each evening, the warmth of his presence, a constant, reassuring fire. The late Duchess was not forgotten. Her portrait still hung in the gallery, her smile serene and beautiful. Cecily had made sure of it. She and Arthur often talked about her, keeping her memory alive, not as a sorrowful ghost, but as a cherished part of their family. One afternoon, Cecily found Arthur carefully pressing a white Lenten rose into his mother's flower album. "So she'll have a new one," he explained simply. And Cecilia's heart had ached with a sweet, uncomplicated love for this solemn, wonderful boy, who was now her son. Lady Honoria had not returned. After a few blistering letters, which Crispin had read and then calmly burned in the fire without comment, she had retreated to London, defeated. The world of society had buzzed with the news of the Duca's shocking marriage for a month, then, as it always does, had moved on to the next scandal. Their life at Grimsby Park was quiet, private, and deeply, profoundly happy. One evening, as dusk was settling, Cecily was in her sitting room, looking out the window at the blooming gardens. She thought back to that first terrible night in this house, when she had traced her initial on the frosted pane, a mark she had expected to vanish without a trace, a name written in frost. How wrong she had been. Crispin came into the room and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. What are you thinking about?" he murmured, his voice warm against her ear. "I was thinking about how a life can change," she said softly. How everything I thought was permanent was fragile. And everything I thought was fleeting turned out to be the foundation of everything." He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "I found something in my father's papers." He led her to his desk and showed her a dusty legal folio. It contained the original deeds to her family's old property, the land that bordered the estate. Her father had not lost it to bad investments. He had been swindled by a man whose name was now a footnote in a long-settled lawsuit. Her legal literacy, the thing she had from her father, had allowed her to understand the complex document when Crispin showed it to her. The land could have been reclaimed years ago. There had been time, but there had not been knowledge. It changes nothing, of course," Crispin said. What is? Yours is yours now, by right of love, not land." But it did change something. It lifted the last shadow of her father's failure, the last vestige of the shame she had carried for so long. Later that night, as she was tucking Arthur into bed, he threw his arms around her neck and hugged her tight. "A good night, Mama," he whispered against her hair, the word so simple, so natural, filled her heart to overflowing. She held him close, her eyes stinging with happy tears. She had come to this house as an outsider, a temporary solution to a problem. She had expected to be dismissed, forgotten. But she had been seen. She had been chosen. She had become the woman who stayed.